Yeah, makes sense. What do you think, Phil?
Well, I definitely think that search is going to be an important point here, because search, if you look at the way, if I look at the way I search information, generally speaking, if I'm on the computer, I'm just looking up general information about, news, restaurant reviews, etc. But when I'm actually at a place, when I'm actually out in a city, I want information that's specific to a particular radius. So what's around me is the only thing that's really relevant to that particular point in time in my life.
Yeah.
So I think with respect to brands, the general conversation, I think, what happens with regards to the location-based stuff is that you either have, there's two angles here. There's local, so the local business owner, and then there's the brand, the big brand, the big brands that most of us work with. I think both have to approach this differently. The bigger brands need to not necessarily look at the platforms first, but think about at what point does location matter, or is it relevant to my strategy with respect to this marketing campaign? For example, I just saw recently Timberland just partnered with geocaching.
Yeah.
Makes perfect sense, right?
Yeah, it was smart.
I mean, they're outside, they're promoting outdoor activities, you're out hunting for, I'm assuming everyone's familiar with geocaching. If you're not, it's essentially objects are hidden in locations throughout the world or in a local area, and then your job is to go out and look for them, and then
Using
sort of
only GPS usually.
Using GPS tools. So Timberland partnered with geocaching to do that.
So Timberland is not a company that owns, they may have some stores, but typically they're sold in other stores, right?
Sure.
They're a consumer brand. So that's a smart partnership. Pepsi's another consumer brand that doesn't have physical stores, but has created some location apps of their own and partnered with some other people. Do you think isn't the bigger opportunity retail, whether it's the local retail people and the larger retail Starbucks and McDonald's that have national chains? How hard is it for these consumer brands like the Timberland, like the Pepsi's? Is it a much more difficult value proposition for them to get involved in locations since they don't own the physical locations?
I think that one of the key things about retail is that there's kind of two components to it, right? There's the concept of the promotion, which is I understand who's in my store and I'm able to present them with some offer at some particular time. It's geo-relevant, it's time sensitive, and it's immediate. I think that the other half of that is that there's kind of a corollary service where I might not be in the store right now, but I'm able to actually do the purchasing through my mobile device. Groupon Now just came out in a couple of markets, and with Groupon Now, I can be walking down the street and go, hey, look, I'm hungry, and I can actually purchase a hamburger on my phone, pay for it on my phone, run all the transaction through Groupon, and then just stop in at the store, show them my phone, and pick it up, right? So I think that when retail establishments are thinking about, how am I looking at this and what am I doing with it, I think that you need to address both things, right? There's the people who are in your store, and that you can do something for them, but then there's also the people who aren't in your store, and what can you do for them? And I think that those are two important questions.
Proximity, whether they're close to you or not. That kind of makes me think about loyalty programs. I have a similar view of location, which is there's opportunities like we're talking about with proximity. You're walking down the street, you either want to find something, or maybe with new apps you get pinged with an offer, like a Groupon and Whirl coming together deal. But then there's also loyalty programs where because you're checking in at a place or because you have an incentive, you go specifically to that place, and the relationship may exist when you're not close to them. Right? What's the opportunity there? Is that significant, or are we still mainly going to be focusing on I'm in this 4-block radius, what are the places near me? Is that the main opportunity? What do you think? Short
term, I think so. I mean, if you talk to local business owners, most of them aren't that comfortable, even with social media yet. They're overwhelmed with everything they have to do to run their business, and all of us technologists are pitching our technology for them as a means to communicate with their customers, but they're just trying to figure out Twitter and Facebook at this point in time.
So thinking past that is a pretty
I think
complex,
it's a challenge. I think it's a real challenge, and I think that there are companies out there like Postling, and there are a few others that are helping business owners interface with those services, a lot like what Momentfeed's doing with larger brands. That's definitely helpful.
Yeah, I mean, with the larger brands, it's most of them manage their social media at the global level. You know, they've got a Twitter and they've got a Facebook page, McDonald's. You know, but now because of these location-based services, they can start to get much more granular and, you know, just communicate with the customers of a certain McDonald's or a certain Starbucks, and start to, you know, be more relevant to them than they are right now in their social media. I mean, these are the tools that we're building, but it also, I mean, for better or worse, it enables chains and franchises to operate more like a local business because they can communicate at more of that local level. And I think that's where local businesses have an advantage because they can have their own Twitter and their own Facebook page and really just build a little community.
The local personality.
Yeah, local personality. And, you know, for better or worse, we're trying to enable big brands to do the same thing.
Yeah, quick thing. I think when we talk about location-based services in a forum like this, it makes sense. But when you talk about that to a business owner, you're gonna, I mean, you know, it's like LBS doesn't. It could mean loose bowel syndrome to them.
Yeah.
It could be anything.
Well, when you show them the analytics, the analytics tend to be very powerful.
That absolutely.
And
That's just getting that in front of them.
Yeah.
And
Once they see like these are your customers in a dashboard, and they're like, here's your mayor, you know, on Foursquare, and then here are the people who check in most frequently. Here's the times a day when they check in, and all of a sudden, you know, I liken it to, you know, kind of in 07 for showing a brand a Twitter search of their brand and saying, oh my God, like, you know, people are actually talking about us. We got to be on this thing. So
When I've heard Starbucks say they've pulled up, you know, their most checked into locations across the country and looked at, you know, are we giving these tech savvy customers the best Wi-Fi at these locations? You know, asking those types of questions. You know, there's some interesting insights to be had. Any questions? Anyone? Okay. Make sure I grab if you guys see anybody with their hands up.
I want to add something. I
Please
think from the consumer perspective, it's also still the process of checking in is annoying for a lot of people, and it's not yet mainstream. So once we overcome this obstacle, then I think it's gonna talk to much more people.
So, and we'll go to your question. Yeah.
So what do you think about, I'd love to hear the panel's opinions on passive checkout.
So that's exactly what I was going to go to. Yeah, I appreciate that support, that mental support. So we're talking about active check-ins when you say that, opting into the interaction, right? We have services, a lot of services now, more increasing. Originally, I think Google Latitude was probably the first passive check-in service, and it's expanding now. Location is much more than a check-in now. So what do you guys think about passive, and what do you think about other technologies that are including location that may not even be a check-in, things like Instagram and other apps?
Well, first of all, I'm a big fan of things that aren't check-ins. I check in on 3 different services every time I walk into a building. But, you know, we're building something that's not a check-in app, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of things that are out there that provide utility beyond the social announcement of your location. You know, obviously businesses can mine that for some really interesting data. But I think the concept of a passive check-in is really interesting because I haven't seen it working well enough to the point where it can become ubiquitous. You know, I don't want to be walking, you know, we walked past a shop in New York earlier today that I would hate to have accidentally passively checked into.
That's all of New York, though. It's like every
yeah,
block.
it's most of New York. You know, one of the things from our perspective that we are really interested in is that because we're something that we do kind of at the end of an experience where you report back on what your experience was like, what we can say is we can say, hey, wow, this person's been in this particular location for 30 minutes and now they've left. And so from our perspective, the fact of somebody going into a place is almost secondary to the act of somebody going out of the place. Because as we look at, you know, we have then opportunity to say, hey, we noticed that you just left Starbucks. How did it go? Or we noticed that you just left, you know, this 5-star steakhouse. How was it? And we can ask them questions about what their experience was like previously, which I don't think is the same kind of thing that you have the opportunity to do when you check somebody in upon arrival.
Yeah.
I think it's really just about reducing the friction. You know, I mean, the passive check-in might not be the answer, but you know, a push notification that knows where you are and asks you if you want to check in would significantly reduce the effort that it takes to check in, and then you say yes. So I think, that's just what the consumers are going to be more comfortable with, is actually having to approve the check-in, even though it kind of passively asks you. And second, I think for the marketers and the brands, that active engagement is very valuable. And, you know, so it's
When
I
you
look at a
decide to check into a place, it's a much
Yeah.
more valuable decision when
Yeah,
you just
it's like I
walk
look
in
at a
with
passive
phone.
check-in as like an auto DM when you follow somebody. It's like there was no effort in that, you know. And
Yeah.
so in the same part of the consumer, there was no effort to actually say I'm here at this Starbucks. And by the way, I think one of the biggest value propositions of that is that you're sharing that experience with your friends. So for the marketers, you know, a lot of this activity right now is just happening organically.
Right.
And I think what we're going to see is when they start really incentivizing the engagements. And so I use that term in general to encompass the check-ins or the photos or the checkouts. They're all engagements with the brand. And to the extent that you encourage that, you will, you know, find value in it.
Yeah.
You know, I think one of the scary things for me, you know, that you were just talking about, Rob, is the whole concept of, hey, asking me if I want to check in. And I'm just imagining a scenario where I'm walking down the street and all of a sudden my phone's like, hey, you want to check in here? You want to check in here?
Mike,
How about
yeah,
here?
Mike,
Well, it would, you would
Chicken here now?
have, obviously you would have had
Opted
to
in or
have checked
something,
in
yeah.
before, and it
Yeah.
would, you know, it would only ask you for the places that you've checked in before.
Phil, you had something?
Well, I was just going to say, if you follow Schneider Mike,
Yeah.
who's very active in the LBS space, great guy. He had a blog about that where he had pictures of people getting
Yeah.
thrown like Facebook logos and Twitter logos as they were running down the street trying to get away. I just had a thought about check-ins as it relates. This isn't really my space, but specific to check-in or checking out. But we're all essentially checking in at the point of purchase every time we make a purchase. So maybe it makes more sense to tie it to the checkout being the checking
actual
out,
purchase.
the cashing out of. In that sense, I don't know where the
Well, so we have Amex now is working with Foursquare. We have
Blippi's
Google.
in the Deadpool.
So we have Google now launching NFC on Android phones. Tying location to the purchase is highly attractive, right? So the future of that is yet to be seen, but the data that you can get, I mean, you're already talking about it. If you can tie it to an actual purchase or you can tie it to an actual specific experience, it becomes much more valuable information that you can tie to loyalty programs and, you know, the amount of money people are spending and
Well, yeah,
what does that look
they
like?
say that this space is the kind of nexus of social, mobile, and local, and I add transactional.
Commerce, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, that's what a lot of this ends in, some kind of transaction, whether or not, you know, whether or not the consumer was already intending to make that transaction, and, you know, the check-in was just kind of on the way there. You know, it's still valuable.
It's like every time you make a purchase, you often, if you go to like a Target or wherever, they give you even Starbucks, they give you the coupon. It's just maybe a digital coupon.
Yeah.
It'd be the same thing, however, I'd be collecting it on my phone and far more likely to use it than the piece of paper that I throw in the trash.
Yeah, well, and in
Yeah,
a
but that's
coupon
scary
or-
for a lot of consumers too. I mean, the adoption of that, I think, is yet to be seen. Whether they're going to connect that information, the spending information, with
Yeah.
the person. I mean, with
I
your
mean,
demographic is. That's.
We all
I think
bank
there's
online,
laws
right?
that might be against that. Question?